Welcome to Flying Raven Studios, where we continue to explore kit, models and techniques from across the world of miniature modelling. In this episode, I'm exploring ways of creating realistic sandstone rocks and cliff faces as part of this Star Wars vignette. Now this build was really fun and easy to make, and I'm really pleased with the final result. And I must admit, I'm now slightly obsessed with painting rocks. During this video, I will show you how I built the foundation rock face, the canyon floor starting with moulded plaster rocks. Then moving on to painting realistic sandstone boulders and sedimentary rock face and sand effects and so much more. So let's get started. So I've been wanting to make a vignette or a mini diorama for this Imperial Dewback from the Star Wars Legion game, which I painted recently. If I gently break it away from the base, I have a plan forming in my head to how I can use this in a display piece. Now first of all, I need a solid base to work from, and this piece of plywood, which has been hanging around after a DIY project, will do nicely. After cutting it to size, this remnant sheet of plasterboard, or drywall depending on where you are in the world, forms the backdrop and is simply glued together with PVA glue. Okay, so having chipped away the top hard edge of the plasterboard to make it look less square, I now need to build up the rock face and the canyon floor. To do this, I'm going to use some rocks cast out of lightweight Hydrocal, using a range of rock moulds, all of which are from the Woodlands Scenics range, and there's a full resource list with everything I'm using today down in the description, including some links so therefore you can go and check them out for yourself and your projects. Now if you've not used this stuff before, then I have a video testing this stuff out to find what works and what doesn't. But having cast the rocks and let them dry, it is just a case of fitting them together like a mosaic or a dry stone wall to create the scene that you want. Now I'm not too worried about cracks and gaps between them, as you can break off chunks to make the pieces fit together better, or simply fill any gaps with plaster. Now you can mix up more plaster and use that to stick the plaster rocks to the base, but I find that if you spread it on the base first, then you need a really thick layer to bed the rock pieces into it properly. So instead of that, I find it a lot easier to spread it onto the back of each piece and then press that into place. Now looking at the edges, there are some voids around the edges, so to play it safe, I prefer to pour some PVA glue into these. And also sprinkling some of the plaster scraps from when I was moulding the rocks onto the PVA will help fill the gaps and with a rock-like texture and build up any sections. Okay, so now we have the foundation of the scene, and now it's time to play with some paint. I love this bit. So having looked at a load of reference photos, first I need to have a solid base colour for these sandstone rocks and cliffs. Now you can mix colour straight into the plaster when you're mixing it and putting it into the moulds, but in this case I did it pure plaster and I'm now going to add the paint, but you can do it either way. So after mixing a nice light rust colour from a light rust and a white, then this is painted over the whole thing. Now I did use an airbrush for speed, but equally you can use a brush very simply. Now having spent some time looking at reference photos, the first colour we're going to use for red sandstone might be surprising. Yep, it's green. Just wait and see how this comes out at the end. Now rather than just slap this on, I'm going to use a technique which I've heard most often being called wet on wet. But rather than using wet paint on the top of wet paint, I'm going to use a large brush to soak the surface in clean water before brushing on the undiluted paint. Now this does behave very differently to just using a wash, for example. So this goes over the whole of the floor as well as the base of the rock wall, so it looks like the rock has been eroded down and away over the millennia down to that layer which now forms the floor. Also I pick out a layer in the rocks and add the green as a band of colour. The next colour is a mud brown, which, using the same technique with water first and then the paint, is applied to all the red areas that I've not painted yet, but also on top of the green over the boulders on the floor and as I start to build up the layers. Then adding in more whites into that mix, I then start to build up the lighter tones on these boulders to really differentiate them from the rock wall behind them. Now this is what I love with this technique. If you look at natural rock and stone, and I mean really look at it, you'll start to pick up all sorts of colours and shifting hues. Personally, I think this is a key element to making really natural looking terrain and scenery, is getting that variation which does not normally occur in man-made things. Now obviously this still takes time and practice to perfect, and I'm still at the early stages of this journey, but it sure is fun. Okay, time to mix up a little bit. So I'm going to stick with a wet on wet technique, but swap out the water for Clean Spirit to use with AK Interactive's enamel track wash. Now this gives a really nice rusty dark brown tone, and I'm predominantly adding it to the more vertical sides of the boulders. Now it looks quite harsh when I first apply it, but once dry it'll settle down really nicely. Now I can use the same technique with the track wash to develop the shadows in the rock wall by adding it to the undersides of the texture in the rock wall and in some of the cracks. Now sandstone naturally has a slightly dusty texture to it, so to help replicate that I'm going to break out the AK Interactive Track Rust Pigment and dab this on using a brush. Yes, some of this will come away, but what does stick will give a nice effect. However, it has covered over some of those highlighted edges of the rocks. So using the side of a very slightly dampened round brush, I can use that to remove some of that pigment in places and reveal that highlight. So after a few minutes figuring out exactly where I want the dewback to go and marking that on the base, I can then start on the canyon floor. To start off, I am using these little self-adhesive grass tufts which have little rocks and stones included, which makes a superb low-level scrub. I'm also going to use very similar ones from Citadel. Now to be honest, the ones with the rocks, then they were part of a set that I was given as a gift from my kids a couple of years ago. So I have no idea where they came from. But I'll put a link to the Citadel version that I'm also using down in the description. But to be fair, there are tons of very similar sets out there. Now to secure the figure. So I'm going to drill holes in 2 of the dewback's feet and then glue in some small pins. Now these pins will push easily into the plaster, but they will help to secure the figure to the base. But I'm not going to glue it in place yet, as I want to do some more work where the dewback will be standing, and that'll be difficult when he's in place. So I'll take him off for now, but the holes will help me relocate it to exactly where I want it to be, the same place later on. Okay, for the sand, I'm going to use AK Interactive's Sandy Desert, which is a redder version of the alternative desert sand. Now I've done a whole video testing this stuff out and different ways of using it and how it behaves. But for this model I will use a silicone tool to place it in the hollows between the boulders. Now but this is a trick I like with this stuff. By simply adding water to the silicone tool and then dabbing it in place is enough to thin the sand effect enough that it starts to settle down into the hollows. Then using a damp sponge or a damp piece of kitchen towel, dabbing the sand effect helps to settle it further down into the base, as well as helping to give it a nice realistic finish once it dries. Now I have the foundation sand down, I can now fit the dewback and then carefully add more desert sand around the dewback's feet, so it looks like the weight of the beast is pushing down into the sand rather than kind of floating along the top. Then I can sit back, look at the overall composition and add more scrub, pressing it down into the sand. Now this is another trick that I like. So having let the AK Interactive Desert Sand get to the point of being almost touch dry, I get that paper towel again, dampen it and then dab it all over the sand effect, which then as it's almost dry gives it a really nice texture. Also, once it is completely dry, you can run your finger over it to remove any remaining ridges in that sand. And there you go. I could have made it a much more complicated composition, but I really like the simplicity of this one. What do you think? Now if you like this or learn something new, please hit the like button and subscribe for more positive modelling content like this. And I will see you on the next project.